The UAR's request a homeowner / community association for documentation. This is a relatively new form, and it's in response to some of the difficulties sellers and listing realtors have had in getting information from the seller's HOA. Under Section 7 of the REPC, it talks about how the seller is obligated contractually to the buyer to provide certain documentation about the HOA to the buyer by the seller disclosure deadline. This form allows the seller and the listing realtor to request that information from the HOA or the COA. And it highlights the statutory language that obligates the HOA or the COA to comply with written request. And this is the written request, and we have found that listing realtors that have used this form are having great success in getting that information on behalf of their sellers. So here's how to fill this out. Under Section 1, it talks about the types of documentations that the seller or the listing realtor is requesting. So if they're asking for copies of CC&Rs, rules, and regulations, then they simply check that box. If they're asking for those and/or the most recent minutes, budget, and financial statements, then they can go ahead and check that box. Both boxes can be checked. Both are going to be required under Section 7 of the REPC. Section 2 of this form describes the types of methods that the HOA or the COA can comply with providing this documentation to the seller. So if the HOA or the COA has an active website, for example, they need to make the documentation free of charge available to the seller. Now they could have a password, and that's perfectly fine, but it needs to be accessible by the seller. Or if the HOA or the COA doesn't have an active website, then the association may email the documentation, or the association could require the seller or the seller's realtor to pick up physical copies from the association's registered address. So there's a number of ways the association can provide the documentation required under the REPC, but they have to provide it. And they have to do so within 5 days of written request. Now, there is a cap as well statutorily, and this form outlines exactly what that cap is as far as the amount that the association may charge for providing documentation to the seller or the seller's realtor. And Section 3 outlines that. Now, I get asked, well, what if the association just doesn't give that documentation? What can happen to the association? Well, under Section 4, it talks about the failure of the COA or the HOA to provide documentation. It talks about reasonable costs to copy the documentation. It talks about a $25 penalty, and that can be an ongoing penalty for as long as the COA or the HOA doesn't comply. And it talks about reasonable attorney's fees being tacked on top of that penalty. So we have found that by outlining what the statute talks about, that many HOAs and COAs get this form and they read it, and then they simply comply with what's being requested. We have found this to be a useful tool in helping realtors help their sellers in getting the documentation required under Section 7 of the REPC.